Hey everyone, this is Matthew Janda for Card Runners, and I'm here with Cutoff vs. Button vs. Blind Play, Part 4, facing 3-bets from the big blind. So what are the goals for this video? Well, we're first going to do a quick overview of the difference between the big blind and small blind 3-betting range, because in the last video, I didn't really get to talk about the big blind 3-betting range too much when we're facing a 3-bet from it and we're in the cutoff. Then we're just going to jump in and randomly generate some boards. Once again, emphasis is placed on speed rather than precision to try to mimic having to make decisions in real time. So we're going to jump right in for the most part in this video, and it should be one that's reasonably easy to watch because we're not going to spend too much on slides. We're going to be talking about like actual hands and randomly generated boards. So yeah, I don't think it will be one that's too difficult to follow, and hopefully it will be a little bit more fun to watch than some of the more theory-intensive videos. So let's quickly look at the big blind 3-betting range. And go ahead and just kind of take it in for a second, but I want to quickly contrast it with the small blind 3-betting range. So in the small blind, we've talked about this already, but I don't have a cold calling range in the small blind when the cutoff opens. So because of that, we just 3-bet all the hands that we think make profitable 3-bets and fold everything else. So because of that, the 3-betting range is not polarized. It consists of only the good stuff when we 3-bet from the small blind. And if you wanted to, you could call it like a linear 3-betting range, and that would probably be a good term for it here because it's not polarized and it only includes, pretty good hands. Whereas in the big blind, we do have a cold calling range. So because of that, the big blind 3-betting range is more polarized. I still don't like the term polarized all that much here, because when you use the term polarized, it works really well on the river, and it sort of implies this, here's our value bets, here's our bluff. Whereas if we're 3-betting something like king-queen, I'm not even positive 3-betting king-queen's right in theory. It's not an awesome hand, and we're 3-betting it because the hand's pretty good, and we don't want to deny the opponent his equity. So the term polarized doesn't work perfectly here. But just note that since we are in the big blind, it's closer to a polarized range because we're calling with all this medium strength stuff. We're calling with ace 10 to ace 6. And then we're 3-betting the weaker aces that can maybe make some of the better aces fold. Likewise, we're calling with all these, medium strong suited connectors, and we're 3-betting the weaker ones because these suited connectors still have very robust equity. But by the same token, 7-6 suited would probably make a profitable cold call in the big blind. We just think it's a little bit more profitable to 3-bet because its equity is so robust. So before we jump into randomly generating boards, just understand that the big blind range, I don't really like the term polarized. I don't really like the term linear. It's definitely not condensed. There's no real perfect way to describe it in my opinion, but just understand what we're doing. We're 3-betting, we're 3-betting the good hands for value. We're 3-betting some pretty good hands because they do pretty well when they're called, and we want to deny the opponent from realizing his equity. So, that's why we're 3-betting ace-jack suited. We're 3-betting ace-3 or ace-2 because they have a good amount of equity, and they can make some better aces fold. And then the suited connectors we're 3-betting, not because they don't make profitable calls, but because their equity is so robust, and we want to keep this range reasonably strong so we can 3-bet more aggressively. So, yeah, a pretty complex range that has definitely been something that took a while to really get to this point over the last few years, but this is currently what I'd recommend right now. The other thing I want to quickly do is I want to take the cutoff 3-bet calling range. So I just copied and pasted it, and we're going to include all ace 10 off and king jack off. I don't think it's that big a deal. Talked about this before. And let's compare it to the small blind 3-betting range and see how much equity each range has. I know I've done this before, but honestly, I don't even remember, so I highly doubt you guys do from the first video. So the small blind 3-betting range had 53% equity, and let's compare it to the big blind 3-betting range. The big blind 3-betting range has 55% equity. So that doesn't mean one range is better than the other, because we can't determine what range is better from equity alone. But just looking at this, I actually do think the big blind 3-betting range is a little bit stronger, because the big blind 3-betting range, since we're only 3-betting 9.2% in the big blind, whereas we're 3-betting 15% in the small blind, because of that, the really premium hands are going to make up a higher fraction of this range. So I'm learning as we go too. So because of that, I'm just saying, you know what? I think we can actually 3-bet a little bit more aggressively maybe. I still am not in love with 3-bet bluffing hands like King 2 and King 3 suited here, but I'm actually going to just get a little crazy with it, and I'm going to throw in like 9-7 suited and 6-4 suited. So I'm going to 3-bet slightly more aggressively. I know that's different than what I did when I made the pre-flop ranges in the first video, but again, I'm learning as we go, and now after having looked at how much equity this range has, and I know we looked at it before, but looking at it again, and then just really thinking, because we're 3-betting a smaller percentage of the time here, aces, kings, and queens, and ace king are going to make up a higher fraction of this range. I do think we can 3-bet a little bit more aggressively than we currently are. So let's see how much equity that has. Yeah, I hope you guys don't mind me changing the ranges, but if anything, that should really just drive the point home that I don't know. I just am always making my best guess, and I want to be very willing to update stuff as I learn more, or as my opinions change. Okay, so that lowers our equity a little bit, and these hands have pretty robust equity, so I think this is fine. Now, the last thing I want to mention is, even though we're really going to be examining this hand from the perspective of the cutoff after having called the 3-bet, we're of course going to have to talk about what our opponent's range looks like. In reality, I don't think we're going to defend that differently based on whether or not the 3-bet came from the small blind or the big blind on the flop. But I still think we're going to want to talk about the range, because our turn and river line might change a little bit based on whether or not the 3-bet came from the small blind or the big blind. Because, again, the big blind 3-betting range is more polarized. And it's good to be aware of that when we're actually playing, so we can have some idea of how often we're going to face the next barrel, or how often our opponent's going to check a call on the later street. So a good example might be, I don't know, I could be a little wrong about this, but I would imagine the small blind 3-betting range is going to have an easier time betting on the flop and check calling on the turn, whereas the big blind 3-betting range might have a little bit more trouble with that, because the small blind 3-betting range maybe has some like King X and Queen X hands that might check a call on the turn on a King X or Queen X board after betting the flop, whereas the big blind 3-betting range doesn't have those kind of hands. If it makes a pair of queens on the flop, it's King Queen or better. So we'll just be aware of that, even though our flop defending range probably isn't going to be that different, I don't think. All right, so let's go. Big money, big money, big money, no whammy, no whammy, no whammy, no whammy, stop! All right, so the first thing we want to do is plug that into Equilab and see how the equity changed. The big blind 3-betting range has 54.5% equity on average on the flop, but we want to see how much it has on this flop specifically. All right, so I'm going to guess here, and I don't want to look at the range while I'm guessing, but I want to think a little bit more. So we were 3-betting from the big blind with ace queens and a couple ace X suited. So I actually think this is going to favor the big blind 3-betting range a little bit more than most board textures do, but I could be wrong. So now I am going to look at the range, and we have the ace queen suited and the ace queen off and the ace kings, but also we 3-bet this ace X suited component. Not everyone 3-bet stuff like this, but as I've mentioned before, I really like 3-betting the, depending on the position, I like 3-betting some high suited stuff that has the really low kicker, like ace 2 suited. So I'm going to guess it's a slight increase in equity. Maybe it goes like 55.5% or 55%. Could be totally wrong. Oh, it's even more than that. Okay, so the ace high board hits the big blind 3-betting range pretty well because we 3-bet the suited aces. So good to keep that in mind. The good thing will be, though, since the big blind 3-betting range wasn't 3-betting ace jack off, whereas the cutoff range was calling with all of the ace jack off, let's check to see how the premium hands look. So we have 9.1% 2-pair or better, whereas the big blind 3-bet has only 8.5%. So even though I usually expect the 3-better to have more like really premium hands on the flop, because the 3-better was 3-betting that somewhat polarized range, I know the term doesn't work perfectly, whereas the cutoff was calling with a pretty much condensed range. Here, since we make the 2-pair in the cutoff cold calling range, whereas the big blind 3-better really doesn't make 2-pair, because of that, we're actually in reasonable shape, despite having only 42.5% equity. Now, that doesn't mean we're going to defend enough to prevent the big blind from profitably betting any 2 cards or anything like that. I don't know yet, but I just mean we're going to be in better shape than we usually will, because despite having less equity, our distribution of equity here actually looks pretty good because we have the 2 pairs. We have like a good amount of premium hands. Okay, so there's a few things I want to talk about for this board texture. The first is kind of exploitative, but I think in general, people don't typically double barrel ace high boards as aggressively as they maybe should. This one might be a little bit different because the 3-better can have like some gut shots with like king queen. But for the most part, I feel a little bit more comfortable floating on ace high boards than I think I do in a lot of other spots, because it's harder for the opponent to barrel because he just doesn't have overcards. So that's just something to keep in mind, that even though our range doesn't have a ton of equity here, like I still would feel pretty fine like calling on this flop with like pocket tens with a spade. That might be the worst hand I call with, although I'm going to float with a decent amount of stuff too. So probably fold. I think I would fold nines, eights, and sevens here. I'm definitely going to defend with stuff like 8-7 of hearts. I'm definitely going to defend with like the 7-6. Let's see, 9-8. 9-8 of hearts I'll defend 2. 10-9 of hearts. So yeah, pretty much almost anything with a backdoor flush draw I think I would float here, because I don't think there's almost any backdoor flush draw that can't turn straight draws too. Like the weakest one is probably like king 9 of hearts, but I still think you can float, probably raise that one to be honest. So we don't want to get in the mindset of where you raise your best hands for value, call your next best, bluff your next best, fold your worst. That still works reasonably well. I want to try to do better than that. So here on this flop, I think it's reasonable to raise ace-jack some of the time, if not all the time, probably some of the time. So because that we can, if we're raising ace-jack, we can also have some bluff raises. Here, I would probably try to raise the bluff. I would probably try to bluff with hands that are a little bit weaker than most of our calls. And the reason for that is because this board texture, a lot of people think is reasonably wet. I tend to not think it's as wet as most people do, but a lot of people think this board texture is reasonably wet. So if you're raising on the flop here in a 3-bet pot, your opponent's going to be pretty tempted to just jam with a lot of stuff, a lot of draws, a lot of pretty good hands, which is a pretty balanced range. But your opponent's going to be pretty tempted to jam with a range like that because the pot's already so big and he's out of position. So I think that's important, because what that means is, like, in this spot, I would rather raise with king 9 of hearts and call with king 10 of hearts, because I think I'm going to raise sometimes and get pushed off my hand when my opponent 3-bets. I feel better about getting pushed off the king 9 of hearts than the king 10 of hearts. Whereas if I call with the king 10 of hearts, I'm guaranteed to realize the equity. If I raise with the king 10 of hearts, I'm not guaranteed to realize the equity. So, if the board texture were different, you might want to actually sometimes raise with a hand, and it still would be considered, I guess, like a bluff raise if you wanted to use that term on the flop. But you could like sort of bluff raise with a hand that would actually make a pretty good call. But you just think, you know what, you're usually going to get to realize it's equity, and you think it plays better in the raising range, so you raise with it. All right, so let's imagine we call with all this stuff that I've already talked about, and the turn card comes a Queen of Hearts. Okay, so the Queen of Hearts bringing the second flush draw is obviously going to change the strength of a lot of hands in both of our ranges. So, to recap what I just said is, we're going to play more of a raise our best hands for value, call our next best, bluff raise our next best, fold our worst strategy. We're going to play closer to that the more often our opponent's likely to 3-bet and push us off some of the hands that were our bluff raises. Whereas as our opponent's more likely to defend against our raises by calling rather than 3-betting, then we're going to be more tempted to start raising on the flop with some like high equity hands that would also make some pretty good calls, because we can say, hey, we can raise with this pair plus backdoor flush draw plus backdoor straight draw. Even though this hand would make a really good call, we can raise with it because we're not going to get pushed off it that often. Here, I do think we're going to get pushed off our bluff raises reasonably often, so I'm just going to call with the better ones. All right, so on that note, like, what would make good bluff raises? So let's just list some stuff. I think, let me see if I can we can just highlight the backdoor flush draw cheat a little. So like king 9 of hearts, I think, is a great example. Queen 9 of hearts, 10-9 of hearts, 9-8 of hearts, 8-7 of hearts. Those are 5 hands right there. And if we're raising those 5 hands, then that would maybe balance out that would maybe balance out 4 ace-jacks or something that were raised. I'm just estimating. If we're raising 4 ace-jack for value, maybe we can bluff with those 5 hands. We can't bluff as aggressively because it's a 3-bet pot. If it were a raised pot, we could bluff more. Yeah. And even something like 7-6, even though we might get pushed off at 7-6, might be okay to raise. Something like that. But something like those, I think those are like the 5 hands I would really want to make sure I'm raising. King 9 of hearts, Queen 9 of hearts, 10-9 of hearts. Oh, we have 10-8 of hearts too. So let's throw that in there. And yeah, so that's like 6 combos, which actually seems about where we want to be. The weakest hand I would call with, as I said, is I think 10s with a spade. Maybe it's a mistake for me to muck 10s, but our range doesn't have all that much equity, so I don't want to get too aggressive here. And then, like, if I were to highlight what I'm folding, so, like, let's think, what are we folding? We're not folding anything that's so I'm going to make a really crappy square here with my mouse pointer. We're not folding anything that's in this area. All right, so let's look at, we're not folding any aces. So we're only folding half the king nines because we're only folding the king nine that are not spades or are not hearts. So we're folding the clubs and diamonds. We're folding the queen nine of clubs and diamonds. We're not folding the jacks. We're folding the 10-9 of clubs and diamonds, the 10-8 of clubs and diamonds, and the 9-8 of clubs and diamonds, and the 8-7 of clubs and diamonds, and then these middle pairs. So off the top of my head, and I really am just guessing, but that seems like we're probably defending here 70 or 75%. So I think we're defending here quite aggressively for our range having not that much equity. But again, our equity is actually distributed very, very well here. We have two pairs, which are awesome. And then even with a lot of hands that don't have that much equity, like let's take Queen 10 of hearts, its equity is super robust. And position is very valuable here. So I think it's letting us defend wider than our equity alone would indicate, because honestly, there's going to be some spots where our range has 45% equity here, where we still fold like crazy, whereas here we have 42% equity, and we're calling a lot. When the opponent c-bets here, so we want to think about his range a little bit more, because the range I just listed, I'm probably going to defend with, whether it's a c-bet from the small blind or the big blind. But the range our opponent's c-betting with, I would expect him to actually be able to check call here on the turn much more comfortably than he'll be able to in a lot of other spots, and that's just because he's going to have ace-x suited. So like here, it's pretty easy. If I were in the big blind, I would check call like kings and queens on the flop, and then I probably would do some like kind of mixed strategy where you can bet some ace-5, ace-4, ace-3, ace-2, and check call them on the turn, or you can just start check calling these on the flop. But I think I would usually bet. No, I don't even want to say that. I would sometimes bet the ace-x and sometimes check it, and then I would, if I did bet one of these hands on the flop, I would check call it. So that seems pretty reasonable there. And then I think once our opponent does bet on this flop, even though he can check call turns with the ace-5, ace-4, ace-3, ace-2, or the kings or the queens if he did bet them, I think it's more likely we see him barreling pretty aggressively just because he has so many ace-queen and ace-king. And since the 3-bet percentage is only 9.8%, these hands are going to make up a large chunk of his range. The 6 actually allows him to bluff a little bit more effectively here than he otherwise would be able to, because just note with these hands that I'm going to unclick, these hands are like getting pairs and backdoor draws and stuff due to the 6. So because the board is a 6 rather than a 2, it does make it easier for the opponent to just double barrel bluff more effectively. And there's not really anything we can do about that. It just happens to be a card that hits his range. It hits these bluffing hands pretty well, and it lets him bluff aggressively and sometimes outdraws. Nothing we can really do about that. So now if on the turn the opponent checks after having bet the flop, I think I would probably bet ace-10 and better. In ace-10, I'm not really that sure on. There's like a big jump in hand quality. Let's see, our best top pair is going to be ace-10, right? Let's do this. Yeah, our best top pair is ace-10, and then the next best hand is the 2 pair, which is the queen-jack suited. So there's a pretty big jump in hand quality there. But I think ace-10, I would probably just bet on the flop and plan to check back on the river. Although I could definitely see how that might be worse than just checking back the turn ourselves. And then I would probably just bet like queen-jack and better. If we don't check back any strong hands after our opponent checks to us on the turn, we are vulnerable to facing overbets on the river. But again, it's just not something I see happen enough. So even though there's 2 flush draws here, if we check back, we'll have a really capped range. I still think it's pretty reasonable to just never check back any strong hands. And realistically, it's kind of hard to get a blank on the river when spades can bring us some flushes, hearts can give us some flushes, and then like 10s and kings give straights. So yeah, I would probably bet ace-10 or better or queen-jack or better for value on the turn. And then for the bluffing hands, it would be most of the flush draws, some of the probably the straight draws like 10-9. You could even turn a hand like I think it could be okay to turn a hand like jack-10 into a bluff on the turn, because a hand like king-queen is going to be a hand that we check back with on the turn now. Our ace-x's that weren't, maybe we should just check back ace-10. So like ace-10 on worst we can check back. Queen-king we can check back. Queen-10 we can check back. So we'll have, I think, a good amount of medium strength hands to check back, where you can maybe bluff some of the jacks. Like you maybe could bluff jack-10 as a gut shot, even though it's obviously a profitable check. It might be more profitable as a bluff. And then, yeah, the straights for like 10-9. The straight draws will bet too. So what I probably should do is make myself list the hands that I would check back. So let's just go with checking back ace-10, final answer. We'll check back ace-10, ace-9, ace-8, and ace-5. Then I'll check back king-queen. King-queen and king-jack. And then that might be... And then, yeah, you can check back a couple of the flush draws too, because you want some stuff that can bluff later. queen nine suited. If we had like queen nine of spades, we would check it back. So any sort of queen with the flush we draw, we check back too. But yeah, I think that would make up the bulk of our checking back range. Yeah, I think so. And then if we did call on the flop with tens with the spade, we maybe would turn it into a bluff on the turn too. So again, that one's, yeah, I think we could, but it's probably reasonably close as well. And then our betting range is what I already talked about, like the queen jack and better. And then let's see how many hands that is. How many hand combos that is. And if we were raising ace jack on the turn of queen jack, yeah, I'm still not sure what we would do with ace 10 here. I think now I'm going to flip flop again, and I think since we were raising, like, I don't want to bet the turn too much once our opponent checks, but since we were raising some of the ace jack on the flop, yeah, we're going to bet, our ace queen and queen jack. But if we were raising some of the ace jack on the flop, then it might make sense to bet some ace 10, because we're still probably not betting too much once our opponent checks to us on the turn if we do bet ace 10. We don't want to bet so much that we're super vulnerable to getting check raised, but if we're checking back some draws, all those hands I just mentioned, and then like some of the ace 10 we check back, some of them we bet, that seems pretty reasonable to me. And then tens, yeah, maybe tens with a spade we should just check back too. If you have a HUD, it's pretty easy to tell what you want to do with some of these really close hands, but without a HUD, it's definitely trickier. Okay, so let's imagine we faced a double barrel on the turn. So what's the worst hand we keep calling with? I think I would be tempted to call with a hand like king queen, but I think that's also probably bad. Let me think a little bit more. So if our opponent bets on the flop, we call, and our opponent bets on the turn, what are we folding? So I'd want to call with like king queen because it's like, a middle pair plus gutter, but that might be bad. So we'll definitely fold jack 10 before that. We'll fold pocket tens before that. What else is there? We'll fold king jack before that. But that might not be enough, and this might not be a turn card where the opponent expects to get a ton of folds. That's the other thing. And that's a little bit more exploitative, of course. But I think in reality, I don't think our opponent's going to expect to get a ton of folds when he double barrels that queen of heart turn. So I've mentioned this rule before, and it's a rule that I heard many, many years ago that I think still works very well, which is bad double barrel bluffing spots often make good triple barrel bluffing spots. So right here, from the big blind's perspective, I think this is a bad turn card to double barrel bluff. But if you do double barrel bluff here and get called, I think the river card, like if the river card's a blank, might often make a good triple barrel card. Because I think if you double barrel here in reality, people are probably going to call on the turn with lots of like queen 10 and queen king, even if maybe should be folded. People in reality will call with them because they now have like middle pair plus a draw. So if they're calling with those hands, it makes the double barrel bad because you're not succeeding very often. But if they do call the double barrel, it will make the triple barrel really good. So just to clarify a little bit, when I say it makes the double barrel bad, I just mean you're not going to get a ton of folds. So it still is totally fine to like double barrel, bluff and semi bluff with your draws and the right types of randomizers. But you just got to understand when you're betting that turn from the big blind shoes, you're probably not going to get that many folds. But if you do get a blank river, like I'll be honest, if we call this, in reality, if I call this turn bet, because I would be shoving so many of like the ace queen stuff or the queen jack stuff if I faced a double barrel. Maybe queen jack can call, but I would at least shove ace queen. So because of that, if we face a double barrel and I call, if the river card comes to 3 diamonds and is a blank, my guess is I'd be folding too much to most opponents in practice because I would have called the turn with too many medium strength hands, and then I'd be tempted to fold them on the river. And in reality, against most opponents, I think they'll be doing that in practice. So with all that in mind, I think if I were playing a lot of tables and playing very quickly, I probably would call the turn with king queen. But if I were playing well and like really slowing down, I think I would fold that hand because I don't think our opponent will be double barreling here that aggressively, and I don't think it's even a hand that's that strong in our range because we just have so many aces and so many like just 2-pair hands, and we even made some straights. And I'd honestly probably rather call twice with a draw that can bluff on the river than call with a hand like king queen that has some draw component and some showdown value, but it's also going to be reasonably awkward. Like I don't love calling a turn bet with king queen and checking back the river. I still think we'll lose reasonably often. So yeah, definitely close, and king queen might be mixed, but I think that's the hand that's on the cusp. I would definitely fold a queen 10, and I think I would even fold a king queen here in reality against like an unknown opponent at no limit 200. All right, so let's talk about the river a little bit more. Let's lock the turn and random up the river. Okay, so the queen. So this one's really tricky, and I think betting frequencies are going to go down a lot for our opponent here. Because on the turn, as I said, queen-king might be mixed. I think in reality, most people are going to call with it. So that means it's really hard for the opponent to triple barrel here. Because our opponent was triple barreling with like probably a good amount of like ace-jack and like ace-king stuff. he was at least betting those on the turn with the intention of maybe firing the river. Whereas now, an ace king on the turn might be kind of thin, but I think people will bet that a lot. Whereas now those hands, like ace king and ace jack, just can't value bet on this river. So I think when we get this river card, we expect our opponent to check a lot. And even once he checks to us on the river, I think you're just going to kind of do the obvious line with the obvious hands. So I would just bluff all the missed draws, and I would value bet all the queen X, and hope that's like close to reasonably balanced. So I'm not a good enough player where I know right off the top of my head if I'm way too draw heavy. In theory, even if this river card comes the queen of diamonds, it's possible bluffing with any two cards after our opponent checks on the river should be super profitable in theory, because we had to risk money by calling on the turn to maybe get the chance to bluff. My guess is that's not completely the case, though, because so many of the hands we were calling with on a turn had such a great chance to improve on the river that I don't think we're likely to get a super profitable bluffing spot. Because, when the river card did come queen of diamonds, since we were getting such a good price on the turn, we would have called with so many draws that a lot of those draws are going to miss. And if we bluff all those draws, then we might be bluffing too much, and our opponent can just, profitably call with any bluff catcher. But I don't think there's going to be all that many draws that don't have a pair either. So let's see. What kind of missed draws can we have? Let's actually look. So no made hand would be like the 10-9 stuff. Yes, so we could have we might have a 10-9 suited, but I think that we would have shipped the turn, to be honest, with the flush plus straight draw that might have shipped. Same with the 10-8 if we floated with that. So we might have king 9 that just called twice. So that can bluff on the river. And then we might even have to turn a hand like Jack X suited in, maybe Jack X of hearts or Jack 9 of hearts to turn into a bluff. So if that's the case, we might not have all that many draws in our range on the river that are just pure draws. Meaning they don't also have a pair. So we have probably king 9 of hearts, king 9 of spades. As I said, I think 10-9 suited does ship the turn, because we can easily represent ace queen when we ship the turn too. So I think we'd want to ship the high equity 10-9 suited if we face a double barrel. So yeah, if that's the case, I was definitely wrong. I think a lot of our flush draws are just going to have a pair, since there's an ace, 2 queens, and a jack on the board. So we don't have that many pure whiffed draws on the turn, at least not that many that I can see. So because of that, it's going to be pretty easy, I think, to just ship the draws that did miss. Maybe we turn Jack 10 or Jack 9 suited into a bluff, and then we also just ship the king queens for value. And keep in mind, though, since we're betting about a little more than half pot on the river after our opponent checks, since it's a 3-bet pot, you're going to have to be really weighted towards value. You're going to need just shy of 3 value bets per every 1 bluff. So even if we were, value betting on the river with let's say, I don't know, maybe 7 queen X hands, we could only have 2 or 3 bluffs. So even though I was talking about us having a whole bunch of draws a second ago, it doesn't look like we have all that many, but we also probably don't value bet the river all that often when our opponent checks. So because of that, it might just be fine to, value ship when our opponent checks. We ship the queen X, and we ship the king 9 suited, and maybe 1 or 2 combos of the jack X suited. So the mistake I think I made here is usually when someone calls twice and there's 2 flush draws, there will be a lot of missed draws on the river. I think that's pretty obvious. But here, I think it's actually a little bit different, because since 3 of the cards are high cards, there's an ace, a queen, and a jack, and since it's a 3-bet pot, that makes it pretty hard for us to have just pure, naked missed flush draws. And that's something that I wasn't putting enough emphasis on a couple minutes ago until I looked at Flopzilla. It's harder to just have the naked missed flush draws here because it's a 3-bet pot, so our range is stronger, and because the pot's bigger relative to our stack depth, I would expect draws 10-9 suited, so 10-9 of spades, to just be shipped on the turn. So those factors combined mean when the river card comes this queen of diamonds, I don't think we really have all that many missed draws. So that means when our opponent does check to us, we could probably comfortably bet all of our, pure missed draws, if we had king 9 suited, and we could definitely, I think, bluff that. And we might even need to turn a hand like Jack X into a bluff. And if our opponent's really thinking exploitatively, it might actually be good if we go out of our way to turn some Jack X hands into a bluff, because it's going to seem very hard for us to have bluffs on this river if our opponent's really paying attention. There just aren't really that many missed flush draws we can have, because it's a 3-bet pot that on the turn had 3 high cards with the double flush draw. All right, let's make another flop. All right, no whammy, no whammy, no whammy, no whammy, stop. All right, so king 10, 7. So the first thing that jumps to my mind is this board is pretty gapped. Like there's, king, skip 2 cards, 10, skip 2 cards, 7. So there's going to be a lot of draws here. And it's also a king high board, which typically favors the 3-better, since in the cutoff we were 4-betting ace king. Okay, so let's go ahead and plug this in. So I'm going to guess this time, again, I'm going to make a similar guess, which is the 3-better probably has like 55% equity. And the reason why, actually it might even be less than that. I'm going to actually guess 54% equity, because the fact that this is a 10 rather than like an 8 is humongous here, because the 10 just really hits the 3-bet calling range very, very well. So even though the king misses the 3-bet calling range, the 10 hits the 3-bet calling range really well, because it makes a lot of pairs of 10s, especially if we have ace 10 off in the range. And it also just adds a lot of draws, which increase the equity of the cutoff calling range. So I'm actually going to guess this goes down to like 53.8%. Oh, even less than that. Wow. Okay, so despite the board being king high, the cutoff 3-bet calling range has a good amount of equity. Let's see how it would be if the board was an 8. I don't know why I did that. I didn't need to do that way. Let's see if this was an 8, how the equity would change. Okay, wow. So a lot of these effects I kind of know, but you can tell I don't know the magnitude that well. And this is something that just would come from studying your game in time. And if you're actually playing a lot, you can just learn in time, like, oh, I'm getting way more folds when I bet on a king 8-2 board than a king 10-2 board. So here, we put if we make the 10 and 8, the equity changes by like 5%. So the 10 is just tremendously good for the 3-bet calling range. The next thing that I really notice about this board texture is, since it is that like a double gapped board that I was just talking about, that means anytime anyone bluffs on this board and gets called, their bluffs are almost always going to have a lot of equity. I mean, there's nothing wrong with that. It just means when lots of hands have lots of equity, you don't usually see people folding very often. So when our opponent bets here and we're in the cutoff, not only do I think we're in good shape because, position's reasonably valuable, but not, incredibly important here. I mean, position's always important, but I just mean relative to other board textures, this isn't one that's super hard to play out of position. But since each range has 50% equity, I think we're going to be defending very, very aggressively against a c-bet. So the worst hand, I think I would fold pocket 9s when I face a c-bet here. And that might be wrong, but I think I would fold 9s and 8s. I'm just going to click what I would fold. Okay, I'm going to fold 9s and 8s. I'm going to fold, not fold 8-7 suited, not fold 7-6, not fold 9-8, not fold you, not fold you, not fold, even Jack 9's double gutted. Geez. I'm not going to fold Jack 10, nothing here. So let's see, not King 9, not Queen 9. Ace 9 can maybe get bluff raised. Because with Ace 9, like if we had Ace 9 of spades, the 8 gives us the 8 gives us the straight draw, and then the Jack and the Queen give us the gut shot, and the spade gives us the flush draw, and then the ace can just be good. Like, I mean, we could just bluff raise with the ace 9 suited, our opponent calls with King Queen if he bet it on the flop, and then we turn an ace. So I think maybe we're going to bluff raise our ace 8, or sorry, our ace 9. Ace 8 would be similar, but we can maybe raise these, maybe fold these, and then ace 5 we're going to fold, so I'm going to unclick that. Is that it? Is that all I want to fold? Yeah, and then we have all the set combos in our range. So how many hands did I have this range folding then? So let's click on this again, cut off first 3-bet flat, and that is 134 combos. If I unclick you guys, that's 118. So we would be defending like a stupid amount of the time here. Let's try to get that. Let's try to find the actual number. So that'd be 118 divided by, I think it was 134. I'll double check in a sec. So that's 118 divided by 134. Yeah. So I have us defending here 88% of the time. And I'll be completely honest. Maybe I would have folded ace 9 or ace 8 on the flop to a c-bet, but I wouldn't. We would at least fold one of the combos each. But honestly, I can see with the 3 to the flush, like looking at my opponent's stats and really determining whether or not I want to bluff raise it. But that means we're defending an incredibly high fraction of the time here. So honestly, I don't think we're necessarily making a big mistake. I think this is just really showcasing that despite the flop being king high, because there is a 10 and a 7, and it adds all that coordination, and it adds so many pairs with the 10 specifically, that it just really isn't a board that the big blind should be 3-betting aggressively. Which is still weird to me because I'm just used to the 3-betting range, c-betting king high boards like crazy. But here the cutoff just does so well that the big blind shouldn't be 3-betting that aggressively. So if you're analyzing your own game, doing stuff like this, I would take the main points, which would be, it's easy to underemphasize how important adding that coordination is when the fact that this is a 10 rather than a 9 or rather than an 8, because it just adds so many more straight draws. It's important to remember that this 7 is also adding pairs and straight draws compared to if like the 7 were a 5. And it's also important to just note that like the 10 actually makes a good amount of middle pairs. Like let's check. So we have 16% middle pair here, whereas if we make it a 9, we have 12%. If we make it an 8, we have 7%. So a pretty drastic change in how many middle pairs there are. So that also will, change the equity of each range. This will also, so since this is a spot where we can defend so easily by calling in the cutoff, we're getting a good price if our opponent bets a little more than half pot. A lot of hands have a lot of equity. It is a spot where once we do call on the flop, especially if we call the flop and turn, it's going to be hard to face like that river ship, or it's going to be hard to face a big turn bet because we called with so many hands that, we're getting a good price and had some outs, but they weren't incredibly strong. It's also an interesting board because we can raise on a rainbow flop, which isn't something that we do all that aggressively in position. But here, we can't have all the sets. I was thinking aces were a set. We can have sets of 10s and 7s. Those can really be raised, and they won't have a bad removal effect because our opponent really shouldn't be c-betting 10s. In reality, people probably c-bet 10s way, way too much when they 3-bet in the big blind and they flop a random pair of 10s than they should. But in theory, I don't think our opponent's going to be betting almost any 10s, and if you bet 7s, it's probably not that many. So those would be fine to raise. And our opponent can, like the same way we have tons of hands that are like backdoor flush draws, already open-ended straight draws or gut shots, our opponent has a lot of those too. So I would still probably try to keep slow playing the 10s and 7s to raise them on the turn if I can. And then that would also protect us from that double or triple barrel that I talked about earlier when we're calling on the flop with a lot of reasonably weak hands. But I don't have too strong of an opinion. If someone wants to raise the 10s or 7s, that's fine. And I think I probably, in practice, would raise the king 10 because it's a little bit more vulnerable. And that might be backwards. Maybe king 10 should be called and 7s raised. But at the end of the day, I think I would raise like the king 10s and the 7s. And then if I did bluff raise, it would be like with the ace 9 or the ace 8, as I mentioned before. A hand like 8-7 would also probably be okay to raise. It's very similar to like the ace 9 and the ace 8. So when I say 8-7, I mean 8-7 of spades or diamonds. The only difference is like ace 9 and ace 8 had a okay pair out, so there were 3 outs to an okay pair, and then it had the backdoor flush draw, backdoor straight draw. 8-7 also has the backdoor flush draw, backdoor straight draw, but it has 2 outs to trips, which are going to be fantastic, and then 3 outs to 2 pair, which is going to be very, very strong. So it's possible these ace 9 and ace 8 should be folded, and then we raise something like 8-7 suited instead. That's something I'm trying to incorporate into my game a little bit more, which is just raising hands that would also make good calls, because like in a spot like this, if you raise on the flop in position, I want to raise hands, even if they're bluffs. I want to like bluff raise high equity hands, and I don't think we're going to get 3-bet on this board texture very often because it is rainbow. So maybe 8-7 is better to raise, and we can just muck ace 9 and ace 8 because right now we're defending crazy wide. Okay, that was a lot of talking. So I'm kind of tempted to do the big blind 3-betting range right now, even though I don't want to spend too much time on it. Let's just look at it really quickly. I know I'm not going over too many hands. But this is a spot where I think the big blind will need to check fold reasonably often, and I think he'll also just need to be prepared to like check call more often than he otherwise would because this range, this flop hits the cutoff so well. So let's see how many hands are better than king queen for the cutoff. So this range has 11% overpair. How much is the cutoff versus 3-bet call have? It has about 10.5, and then top pair is going to be king queen. So off the top of my head, and I don't know this for sure, but I don't think if we go bet, I don't think our opponent's going to really need to call down with worse than king queen. So if we're in the big blind, I don't think we can go bet with king queen very effectively because it looks like king queen or better makes up about, well, I mean, let's just do it, right? Let's not be lazy. So like it affects the viewer about being lazy. It's just whether or not I'm lazy, and I'm trying to share my desire not to do it. But okay, 14 combos is an overpair better. And then we add in the 12 king queen. So that would be 26 divided by 134. Let's look this up. 26 divided by 134. So that's 19.5%. And then if, the opponent called down 2/3 of the time on each street, so that'd be like, that'd be like 0.667 times 0.667 times 0.667. Okay, so that'd be 29%. So the opponent's definitely going to have to call down with. The problem is when you bet king queen for all 3 sheets here from the big blind's shoes, even though the big blind might, even though the cutoff might overall have to call down weaker hands than king queen now by the looks of it, at the end of the day, tons of these hands are going to improve on the turn of the river. So unless the turn of the river are like complete blanks, like if the turn of the river are complete blanks, then yeah, we probably could have gotten 3 streets of value going bet, bet, bet with king, queen, and it would have worked out really well. But since the turn of the river aren't going to be complete blanks usually, there's going to be 2 pairs and straights and trips and stuff that gets there. I don't think king, queen can bet all 3 streets. So because of that, when we're in the big blind and we're already not in that good a shape on this flop, I think it's much more appealing to start checking hands like king, queen. So, it's fine to bet them and check call them on the turn too, but I think I would mostly check on this flop if I were in the big blind. And so since I'm mostly checking a hand that can maybe go either way, like king, queen, I'm going to be a little bit more likely to check that too, to sort of protect my checking range. And then I would also try to check raise a little bit more aggressively here than I think most people do. So like if we had pocket aces and we check and our opponent bets, I would definitely put in the check raise. You can also check raise bluff with like the 3 to a flush, 3 to a straight stuff. It might not be too bad to check raise bluff with a hand like even like 7, 6 of diamonds. It's a high equity hand that can turn some good stuff. So yeah, so I think the big blind should mostly be checking here, though in reality I think most people will bet it too much and then they'll check fold too much. So like I know this one almost for sure. Like if I was playing a bunch of tables, I probably would just bet here. I'd check fold like all these ace crap hands that just whiffed, and I'd probably check fold the ace queens. And oh no, ace queen's a gutter, so maybe I would check call that. But I'd probably check fold like all these ace stuff that missed, and then I'd probably check fold the stuff down here that whiffed, which also seems fine. So actually that seems okay. So hold on, let me clarify that a little bit. So as long as like we got to make sure we're check calling here. So most people that are playing are going to bet. Like, this is what I think most people are going to do at, like, no limit 100. They're going to check fold, like, their really, really weak stuff, the stuff that I just mentioned. And then they're going to check call some of the medium strain stuff, but they're also going to bet too much. They're, like, not going to really check call any really good stuff, and they're not going to check raise enough. So that's what we want to make sure we're not doing. So, like, it might be better to check call king, queen, and ace, queen, rather than bet them, even though most people would bet them, I believe. And we also might want to, check raise some of the stuff I already mentioned, like the 7-6 suited or the backdoor, or the gut shots or the backdoor flush draw through to a straight stuff. Because we want to be protecting our checking range, and the best way to do that usually is by, or I shouldn't say that. The thing that protects our checking range the most is by check raising, because that punishes the opponent from betting. Cool. So yeah, I think most people would bet here too much. We want to make sure we're not making that mistake. Okay, so that was a lot of talking for that board texture. Again, I'm talking a lot on just a few board textures in these videos. All right, so let's randomly generate the turn and go back to imagining with the cutoff. Okay, so awesome. If the middle card pairs and we're the caller, it's just almost always fantastic for us, right? Because our opponent really shouldn't have bet 10x's even if he had them on the flop. 10x seems like it makes like the obvious check calling hand. Whereas if we face a bet and we have 10x, we're never going to raise it. We're always going to call. So 10x would just be a fantastic turn card for our range in the cutoff. And then if we called on the flop and the turn card came to 10, I would really just, when our opponent checks us on the turn, I'm not even going to list every combo. I'm probably going to bet like almost every sort of draw or every sort of hand without showdown value. And then I'm going to bet like any hand that's like 10x or better. And we have so many 10x's, I don't think it's a huge problem if we do that. If we did have pocket aces or something still, like if we didn't raise them on the flop, I'd probably still bet pocket aces too. Okay, cool. So that one was super easy. Let's do the river. And once again, like if we did bet on the flop, and we were the big blind, we should be checking on the turn like crazy if the turn card is a pair. All right, so the river's a 6. So that's not going to change things too much after the turn because 8-9 probably should have folded or bet somewhere. So if we bet 8-9, I guess, in the cutoff on the turn and our opponent called, then yeah, it's gonna improve us obviously that we hit the 6. So now that we have the straight, but I don't think 8-9 is going to be that big a deal here. And then the 7-6, if it is in anyone's range, it's already been counterfeited by the 2 10s. So I think this river's pretty close to a blank. So it's mainly just going to be stay the course, which is if our opponent checks to us again, we're just going to bet like 10x and better in some air. We probably can't bet all of our air, so we might need to like give up with some of the ace high hands if we have them, or we might even just need to give up with a couple of the draws. But like the ace high flush draws specifically, I would give up with. And then, bet 10x and maybe bet some of like the really weaker air, like queen jack, that kind of stuff. And then on this turn and river run out, I think the opponent should be, the big blind should be checking at a really high frequency. This was already a bad flop to begin with. And then the turn card was really bad for the flop betting range. So I don't think you're going to face 3 barrels here very often from a good opponent if you're in the cutoff. Okay. So I'm going to try to go a little bit faster still because I really want to make this seem like, you're playing live and having to make fast decisions rather than having time to use Flopzilla. So I'm about to randomly generate a flop, and then I'm going to really quickly try to tell you like what the worst hand in the cutoff I would call with is. All right, let's go. Ready, set, go. All right? So ace 5-3. I think I would call with like 9s or 8s with a club. And then I think I'm also going to call with any king, queen, or king, jack with like the king of clubs, the king, queen with even the queen of clubs. Again, it's an ace high board, so I don't think we're going to get double and triple barreled here all that much. So I'm pretty willing to float with a lot of those hands. And then also I think on this board, since we don't have like, remember when there was a 10 and there were just straight draws and gut shots everywhere. Here, since it's really low, this isn't really making, other than 7-6, which is like, okay, that's, 4 combos, who cares? We don't have any possible gut shots here. So we need to more aggressively defend with like our king, queen, and our king, jacks that have like the club. Even king, queen. All right, so let's unclick everything that I would fold most of the combos with. So I'm not going to fold, even the suited stuff though, remember, I'm only folding half the time because I'm not going to fold most of the diamonds or the clubs. I'm definitely not folding the clubs, but even the diamonds. So let's say I can fold like half the king 9, half the king 10, half the king jack, half the queen jack, half the queen 10, half the queen 9, and then we're also going to fold, so I said pocket 8s with a club. So I think I would, it's kind of hard to say if like our 9's better or our 8s with a club better. So like our 9's without a club better or 8s with a club better. Kind of hard to say. But let's say we fold like 6 more combos from let's say we fold the 7s. We don't fold the 7-6, but we fold like, let's say half our 8s and half our 9s. So what would that get us to? I want to see exactly how many combos that is. So I'm going to actually pause and count real quick. So I just counted, and I have us folding about 40 combos, given what I just said. So that would be, so let's say we defend 101.5, 101.5 divided by 141.5. So you'd be defending about 70% of the time here. That seems okay. So small sample still, but notice in most of these cases, like I'm not having trouble trying to find, enough hands to defend on these flops that prevent our opponent from being able to properly bet any 2 cards. And that doesn't mean these ranges are right by any means. I just mean like I know back in the day it would have seemed like insane to call a 3-bet this wide. But again, you're getting like 2-to-1 odds pre-flop. You have the advantage of position, and getting that good of a price and having the advantage of position, and I think you're going to be able to make this work with enough practice. And I could be wrong as well, but I think most people, if they, like what I said, calling with the 8s with a club, or else like king jack with the king of clubs, I think those were the 2 like weakest hands I would call with. I don't think most people would have a problem with those hands. And again, I could be wrong. And if those do seem too weak to you, by definition, since I'm saying those are the weakest hands I'd call with, I think it's very close to break even, very close to being between calling and folding. But if you do think they're just too weak, then just fold them. I don't know for sure, but for the most part, I think it's pretty reasonable to defend pretty aggressively on most flops. We just are always getting good odds. When our opponent 3-bets his pre-flop, we get good odds. When he bets half the pot on the flop or a little bigger, we get good odds. So we can defend wide. I don't want to talk about the big blind range too much here because that's just not necessarily the goal of this video, but as you can imagine, you're probably going to face a lot of 3-barrels here once we call on the flop because our opponent's 3-betting range just included, let's look, a lot of, the ace high just hits it really well. Oh, I forgot to do this part. So I think the big blind is actually going to have a lot of equity here, but I still think we can defend as wide as we talked about, but maybe it's a little too wide. So if I had to guess, I'm guessing the big blind has like a lot of equity, like 57% equity, 58% equity here. All right, 60. Wow, that's a lot. So because of that, I'm thinking 2 things. Number 1 is now those hands that I thought were on the cusp for the cutoff calling range, and I still think they're really close to break even. Maybe we can fold those, we just fold a little bit more, so our range is a little bit stronger on the turn. And then the other thing I think is I might have too many ace X's in this 3-betting range because it seems like the big blind 3-betting range is just hitting the ace high flops really, really, really hard. So like let's check it this way real quick too. Let's compare ace 5-3 compared to king 5-3. Okay, that already is decreasing the equity. And then if we make it the queen, it's probably going to decrease by a lot more. Oh no, it doesn't. Let's try the jack. Okay, so the jack is actually the bigger change. So yeah, the ace is just specifically hitting the big blind 3-betting range so well because we were 3-betting with we're 3-betting pre-flop from the big blind with so many ace X suited. So yeah, I think now if I was, you can always be tweaking the pre-flop ranges. It's not a big deal. And the stuff that I'm talking about, like again, I'm trying to emphasize like in reality what I do if I was playing like at an unknown no limit 200 table online. I would 3-bet these hands pre-flop against an unknown in the cutoff. the ace-x suited because I think they work really well. That said, if I had to actually hand my opponent my range or tell my opponent my strategy, in theory, if you're playing optimally, you can tell your opponent your strategy and there's nothing he can do about it. Whereas here, I think if I actually told my opponent my strategy, I might have a little bit too many aces in the big blind 3-betting range, so maybe I need to take out like the ace-4 and the ace-5. That said, we're just going to keep going full course. We're going to stay on course for this video, and we're going to just keep pushing through using these 3 bets with the ace-x suited because I think they work quite well in practice. Okay, so this is a board texture where we are going to face a lot of double barrels, so let's lock the flop and randomly generate it. All right, so it's a 7. So I maybe defended a little bit too wide on the flop. We already talked about that. On the turn, if we face a double barrel, I'm going to fold all the middle pairs. I'm going to pretty much keep calling with my flush draws, keep calling with like my pairs plus flush draws. So for example, if I had 7-6, I'd keep calling with it. And then I'm going to call with all my aces. So let's see how much we're folding on the turn. And since poker's a multi-street game, it's not a problem if we do fold a lot on the turn necessarily, because our opponent had to risk money. Like if we called a lot on the flop, our opponent had to risk money to get the turn bluff opportunity. So we don't need to defend enough on the turn to prevent our opponent from being able to properly bet any 2 cards. But that said, if we're folding like crazy on the turn, probably means we did something wrong here. So we had about 100 combos in our range on the turn. Let's see what we're folding. We're going to be folding, see, I'm going to have to pause and count this again. All right, I'm going to do it. I'm going to try to figure out how much we're folding. I think I have us folding about 35 or 36 combos. We still have a lot of top pairs. A lot of top pair or better. Even if we don't have the 7s in our range, we got a lot. So because of that, I think we're going to end up folding like to a turn double barrel like 35% of the time. That doesn't seem too bad. And that was with us calling as wide as I recommended on the flop because we are getting a good price and we have position. So yeah, I think we'll just fold those hands that I already mentioned, which is just the middle pairs and then the hearts, or sorry, the diamonds that didn't turn the flush draw. All right, and then the king queen and the king jack high that had like the high club that didn't turn the club. All right, so let's randomly generate the river. And the big blind's range is, I think, pretty easy to play on that. Oh, sorry, I didn't lock it. The big blind's range is, I think, pretty easy to play on the turn. He just double barrels his really good aces and some bluffs. All right, the river's a 6. So just don't be afraid of the fact that the river card made a straight. I mean, this is actually really close to a complete blank. I don't think the big blind 3-betting range has that many 4s. It might be has a couple, but not that many. Not that many. We can look real. I don't want to look. I want to go fast. All right. So when we face a river jam, I think I'm going to call with like. In reality, I think I'm going to be folding too much to a bet here. But I would be calling with like 2 pairs or better and ace queen, which I think would make us fold a little bit too much. But I think that's okay. And again, our opponent had to risk money on the turn to maybe get a profitable river bluffing spot. And I do think this river card, even though it's closer to a blank, it gives our opponent some straights, but it doesn't give us any. Because I think the opponent could have 4-5 suited, 4-6. I am going to cheat. I don't remember if I even put those. All right, yeah, 4-5 suited, 6-4 suited, and ace-4 suited. So ace-4 suited might not have been played the way where it bets every single street, but I do think this river does favor the opponent. So I think it's okay to be like, you know what? Our opponent risked a lot of money to get into this river spot or situation. It's okay if we fold enough that he can properly bet any 2 cards. So if I have to call on the river, it's probably going to be like, excuse me, with ace queen or better and 2 pairs. And I'm going to be fully aware that when we're calling with those hands, like most are just bluff catchers. We're not happy at all about being in this river situation. If our opponent checks to us on the river, we're really not going to bet very aggressively. We could bet maybe some ace queen and some air, something like that. But for the most part, we're not going to have any really premium hands on the river, and we're going to expect our opponent to be doing most of the betting. That said, if he does check to us on the river, with only having a little bit more than a half pot size bet left, we probably want to bet like all in with our ace queen, and then some of our misdraws that I've called with twice, and then we'll also bet with like our 2 pairs or straights. We don't have straights, sorry. I don't even. Well, we might have like 8-9 of clubs, but like we'll bet like our 2 pairs, which we should have at least a couple. I think we'll have 7-6 suited. Okay, cool. So let's randomly generate one more, and this might be the last one. All right, so king queen 5. So going fast, I'm gonna guess the button has, or sorry, the cutoff has like 48% equity here, and the big blind like 52. I think this is overall a good flop for the cutoff cold caller. Again, like 2 high cards just means a lot of straights, a lot of gut shots. Sorry, straight draws and gut shots. There's a lot of 2 pairs that the cutoff can have. I mean, the 3-better can have them too. And then the 3-bet caller in the cutoff can also have like lots of ace queen, queen jack, queen 10, king jack stuff. So I think overall this would favor the 3-bet calling range more than the average flop. Let's look. I'll even get the right suits. King of clubs, queen of spades, five of diamonds. So yeah, let's say 53, 47% equity, final answer. Okay, cool, right around there. So yeah, this is a good range. This is a good flop to be in the to see when we're in the cutoff. I expect both players to bet here reasonably often. The big blind's still definitely going to bet reasonably often. But he's also going to check, I think, reasonably often too. If he checks to us, it should be pretty obvious. But like, I would just when almost I ever have two high cards, and this is in a single raised or a 3-bet pot, I tend to just usually on the flop bet like all of the top pair hands, and then check with all the middle pair hands, because I don't need to check as often with like our top pair no kicker, because like. I know I don't have it here, but like, let's imagine I had king 4 suited in our range and ace queen. They're very similar hands. So I can like check back the ace queen and bet the king 4 and then just plan to check the king 4 later. Not a huge deal, but I'd usually bet the higher pair and check the middle pair, because that means we're less likely to be value betting against ourselves. So just to repeat that, like if we bet king 4 on this flop, our opponent will have 3 queens that we beat and 2 kings that beat us, that were, possible in his range. Whereas if we have whereas if we have ace queen, then there's 3 possible kings left and only 2 possible queens. So we're more likely value betting against ourselves than if we had like a king and a 4 in a hand. Because then, yeah. Sorry, talking while I try to think ahead. But you can clearly see how the removal effect favors us betting king 4 if we're going to bet and checking ace queen. But yeah, not a big deal. Okay, so if we face a check, yeah, bet the top pair, check the middle pair. Pretty much checking like all these medium pairs too. I wouldn't really slow play anything. I don't think people bet big often enough. If you want to slow play something, you could probably slow play some king queen. Ain't a huge deal. And then yeah, I would bet most of the gut shots. You could even check back like some ace jack on the flop if you wanted, to be honest. But I would bet like, obviously bet stuff like 10-9. I'd bet a lot of 3 to a flush stuff. So I'd probably bet like ace 8 suited, ace 9 suited with the backdoor flush draw. Again, ace 10, ace jack would probably be a mixed strategy. Bet sometimes, check sometimes. I'm trying to see if I missed anything, but yeah, this should be pretty easy one to play. Okay, cool. So let's imagine if we face a bet, what's the worst hand that I call with? Probably pocket tens. I think I would just fold 9s, 8s, 7s. I just muck them all. There's no possible straight draws, flush draws. So I muck all these 3. Muck all this stuff. Jack 9 suited to defend, queen 9 suited to king 8, and then ace 9, ace 8, ace 5. We could probably bluff raise some of these. So I'm going to go back to seeing what our calling range was. So let's imagine we muck all this stuff like I said. I just didn't count again. Wow, sorry. All right, so that's 138.5 combos. We fold all this stuff. That gets us to, we don't fold 10-9. That gets us to 104.5 combos. We'd also fold, if we face a bet, we'd also fold some like the ace 9, ace 8 stuff. So we maybe defend like 100 combos here. So it'll be just like before. We're defending about, actually, I don't know if this is like before. It's 100 divided by 138.5. We're defending like 70% of the time. Okay. All right, so yeah, we're defending plenty on this board. And then if we are going to raise here, I would raise with like the 3 to flush, 3 to straight as usual. So I unclicked the 7-6 suited. That might have been a mistake. It actually probably is. So if we're playing really well, look at your opponent's stats and decide based on that. But I think it's really reasonable to be like, you know what, let's raise 7-6 suited because it has so much robust equity. And then another option is also to raise, like we don't really have better bluff raising options here. We could bluff raise like some of the 10-9 suited stuff too, or the Jack 10 suited stuff too. Jack 10 suited is open-ended, but like the 10-9 suited and Jack 9 suited, that can also be bluff raised. So yeah, so Jack 9 suited, 10-9 suited, 7-6 suited, I think those are like the good bluff raising candidates. All right, so the 6 of diamonds. So it should be really easy to play this. If we face a double barrel, I think the worst hand that I would call with would probably be like Queen 10, I think is probably the worst hand that I call with again. And again, that could always be wrong. And then I would also call with like the Jack 10. I would call with any of like the backdoor flush draws. It might be okay to ship like some draws plus value stuff on the turn, but for the most part, I don't think we do that very often. So yeah, I would say the weakest made hand I would call with on the turn would probably be Queen 10. Pocket 10s I would muck. Yeah. And then I think even Queen 9 suited I would muck if it wasn't the Queen 9 of diamonds. And then, yeah, everything, I mean, this should be really easy to play if you face two barrels. And then if our opponent checks to us on the turn after betting the flop, I would probably not bet here too aggressively because we just have so many like medium strength hands. But I think I would bet like, where are you? We only have 20.7% top pair. I think I would bet like king jack and better. I don't think we're going to be able to follow through on the turn and river with like king 10 or king 9. Even king jack might be kind of thin, but I think I would go for it. Because the thing is, like, when I bet king jack on the turn, it's one of those spots where it's like, if my opponent check raises, I'm like, oh no. And then I probably would curse. But if he check calls, I don't really think we're beat. If our opponent check calls, we might be splitting, but I don't really think we're beat. So I think, we can bet king jack and better on the turn, and then we'll sometimes bet king jack on the river. Depending on what the river card is. Like, I don't think I'd bet it on a diamond as aggressively. I don't think I'd bet it on like a 10. Obviously not like an ace or a queen. But I think we can start with betting king jack on the turn and sometimes bet it on the river. So yeah, pretty easy spot to play. Let's randomly generate the river. 2. All right, same deal. I mean, this is just going to be easy to play. I think I would call down just any king or better here. And that looks like about right. Maybe that's a little bit too tight. It depends on how aggressively we were raising earlier. Ace queen might be a mixed strat on the river. But I think ace queen is pretty much where you're going to want to draw the line for calling down here. And then if our opponent went bet, checked on the river, honestly, I would just have a very, very tight betting range. Because we're just going to have so many medium strength hands on the river, and it just doesn't really accomplish much to bet the medium strength hands. So if we do get to the river with the missed draws, or like some of the 2-pair, or some of the, I don't think we can even have sets. If we did get the river with some missed draws and some like 2-pair, and if we don't have 2-pair, maybe we'll just be capped at king jack, then it probably is okay to then bet the river with a range of like king jack and the missed draws. But that said, I would not be betting this river that aggressively. If we called twice and our opponents bet twice, then he has a very polarized range, whereas we have a very condensed range when we get to the river. And when the polarized range checks to the condensed range on the river, the condensed range usually just checks back a ton with all of its medium strength hands. So for the last 10 or so minutes, I want to randomly generate some flops, turns, and rivers really quickly, and then say what I think the worst hand I would call with when facing a bet is, and just go really, really fast. I unfortunately haven't been able to get feedback from the last video I made yet because it hasn't been released yet at the time of making this video, but hopefully that'll be something you enjoy and pretty useful. All right, so let's just start going really fast. Oops. All right, so random flop. Ace, 10, 7. So the weakest hand I think I would defend would be like 9s with a heart. And I could see that being a bluff raise rather than a call even. I think that would be fine. And then I would defend like all the gut shot stuff here. Since there is a 10 on the board, just note it. Really, this board texture is we're gonna do really well with in the cutoff 3-bet calling range. All right, so and the weakest draw I would call with here is just the gutters that I already mentioned. Right, randomly generate the turn. There's a 9. So here I think I'm gonna need like queen 10 or better to keep calling. It gets weird though because king 10 and jack 10. Well, king 10 has no gut shot. Queen 10 has a gut shot. Jack 10's open-ended. So yeah, I'd rather defend jack 10 first, then queen 10, then king 10. But yeah, the weakest hand I would defend with on this turn is, I think, queen 10, and I even think that's really, really close. Let's randomly generate the river. And then on the river, things just get weird. If we're facing like the 3rd barrel here, I think in order to call down, we're going to just need like, this is just going to be a spot where you like side calling with, I think, some 2 pairs. And then I think you might even have to side call with some stuff that's a little bit better than that. But for the most part, this river card, it's kind of going to be like ace jack got there, jack 10 got there, queen jack got there. Yeah, I don't think we're going to want to defend that. We're going to have a lot of straights here. So because of that, I think, I don't think you will need to defend any top pair stuff. I think you can just defend 2-pair or better, and you might not even need to defend all 2-pair. But anyways, yeah, I'm not going super fast now because I'd have to count the combos, but we'll have a lot of straights, defend the straights, probably defend some of the 2-pair. Look at your opponent's stats. All right, let's randomly generate another one. All right, queen 7, 2. So the weakest hand I'm going to call with on this flop is probably going to be like just some ace jack thing with like the ace of hearts. I probably even call ace 10 with the ace of hearts. So final answer, ace 10 with the ace of hearts is probably the weakest hand. That's a really weak made hand and a really weak kind of draw, but I think that'd still be what I would defend. Definitely calling with all the middle pairs and stuff. And then here I would not have a raising range, so you'd probably end up floating with like some of the 8, 9 of diamonds. Randomly generate the turn. Turns a 9 of hearts. Weakest hand I'm going to defend with here is probably queen jack without the heart. And then, I think queen jack without the hearts, the weakest hand I would defend, and then fold, like, of course, the 10s and the 8s without the hearts. I'd probably still fold 8s with a heart. 10s with a heart I would defend. All right, let's randomly generate the river. Oh, sorry. Randomly generate the river. the jack of spades. So the weakest hand I would call down here if I faced a barrel on all three streets would probably be like ace queen. That's my guess for like what you need to defend with. And even then that might be mixed because ace queen is just 12 combos. It makes up so many combos in our range. 11 combos in this case because one's the nut flush. That it might be a mixed strat, but I think like if we face all three barrels, ace queen and better is what we defend. I think we can muck king queen by the river. All right, let's randomly just keep going. So weakest hand is tens. I consider tens weaker than 9x's. Like some 10 stuff, we'll defend all our gut shots. We'll defend ace queen with it. So I guess that's a better. Those are weaker than tens. I'll defend ace queen with probably ace queen with the queen of diamonds. I'll defend or ace jack with the ace of diamonds. All right. So again, final answer, and just note that the 9 is going to actually make our range quite a bit weaker than if it's for a 10, but the 9's still quite good. It's a lot better than if it was an 8. All right. Let's say we face a turn barrel 2. If we face a double barrel on the turn, I'm probably gonna. I think I'm going to fold tens even though I'm really not like doing it. And then I probably would defend with any pair of kings. And then I'm going to fold like all the gut shots and stuff on the turn and all the high cards. So yeah, I think I would fold tens on the turn just because they're so vulnerable to being double barreled. I think that's a very good turn card for our opponent's range since all of our gut shots and stuff missed and our opponent now is picking up like additional flush draws. And it's still hard for us to have a jamming range so he gets to realize his equity. So yeah, not a very good turn card, I think, for our range. And I think I would even make myself muck the tens and then defend with any king and then defend with some draws. And then on the river, I'd probably call down on the river with like... exploitatively, I think you can call down even wider if you know your opponents are like bluff happy. That's kind of obvious, but on the river, I think I would call down like king jack, some king jacks and better. I think that would be sufficient, and we would fold the king tens and we would fold the... King 9 would make 2 pair, and I've already raised at some point. So yeah, we'd probably mostly fold King Jack, I think, or I don't want to even guess at that. I think King Jack's the hand where we kind of draw the line on the river. All right, let's do the next ones with assuming that our opponent's like checking to us. All right, so we randomly generate the flop, and our opponent checks. Didn't we like do this exact board? All right, I'm gonna generate another one. All right, so Ace 9-9. So if our opponent checks us on this board, I think he's going to be check calling a lot. So this is a board where exploitatively, I think it actually kind of benefits you to like check back with a lot of air hands with the intention of bluff later. So just on this board, I would bet like my good aces, I would bet my 9s, I would bet like my high equity, robust equity bluffs. Like I would probably even bet like Jack 10 off because it just is through to a straight and it can make some dominating hands fold. I would probably bet like a lot of the 3 to a flush, a lot of the 3 to a flush stuff. It doesn't even need to be 3 to a straight. And then obviously bet the flush draws, but I would like definitely check back with something like king, queen of spades. Like I would not bet that, even if I think it's a profitable bet. I want to keep my opponent's dominated kings and queens in, and it doesn't really have much robust equity. So I would check back stuff like that. I would check back 8s and 7s and stuff like that. Check back like a lot of king, queen, and king jack off stuff, as I already kind of mentioned. And then I might even check back some like queen jack stuff if it doesn't have the backdoor flush draw. Because I think it's just beneficial to like delay your bluff later here. And so if your opponent checks twice, you might think you checked back on the flop with ace 10 and now you're betting. All right, so let's say we bet the flop, he calls, turn comes a queen of spades. So at that point, I think I need ace queen or better to keep betting. Would not keep betting. Like if we did bet ace jack or ace 10 on the flop, which I think it would have been fine, I would not bet them on the turn. Ace 10 might have even checked on the flop. And then yeah, just keep barreling with your bluffs. And then check back all the queens. You probably turned a good amount of queens. Check back those. And yeah. And then let's look at the river. River's going to be weird. But if our opponent check called all 3 streets and we got that river, I'd be pretty tempted to jam exploitatively too much as a bluff because I don't think people will check call twice with flush draws, whereas we can have flush draws. That became the flushes. And I think in reality, our opponent would fold everything that's not ace queen or better. So I think on this river, we're getting a good price on our bluff, so we don't need the bluff to work more often than not. It can work significantly less often than half the time for it to be profitable. So on this river, I'd probably be too bluff happy in practice, but in theory, what randomizer you use probably isn't going to matter all that much. So yeah, I would say on the river, I would value bet ace queen and better once again. I don't think the flush card really gave our opponent any flushes. So yeah, ace queen or better to be my value betting range. Then I would probably try to bluff too much if I could, because I think my opponent's just going to fold like some ace king, ace jack, ace 10s on the river. So this will be our last board. All right, ace 10-10. That's too similar to the last one. I lied. This will be our last board. King 8-5. So if our opponent checks us on this board, I'm firstly pretty surprised because I expect our opponent to c-bet pretty aggressively here. It's a good board for his range. I'd probably start value betting at like king jack, I would really emphasize checking back a lot here, because I'm very suspicious of an opponent that checks on this board, though he might be checking to check call with a lot of queens, jacks, and tens, but we're not going to get 3 streets of value against those anyways, but I do want to get the value now. That said, yeah, I probably would bet king, queen, king, jack for value and check back pretty often here, because this board is good for our opponent's range. So yeah, final answer, weakest hand I would bet here is like king jack, I think. I'd bet all the king jacks and check the king 10. I also don't mind if we bet with like 9s, because we might just get value from 8x and they're vulnerable. So yeah, I would also bet with like 9s. I know that's kind of like a gap there, but 9s I think are the right mix of strong and vulnerable that I would bet with them. So yeah, weird board, but if our opponent bets, I do that. And then again, emphasize betting with the hands with robust equity. I would not bet here with something like ace 9 of spades. I would just check it back, hoping I can bluff it later, because I want to bet with hands that have robust equity. And since I just told you I was checking back like king 10, king 9 on the flop, I need some hands that can, bluff later when I value bet those hands. So I think I would check ace 9 or something like that back to bluff later. Same with a hand like queen 9 of spades. All right, so let's randomly generate the turn. So if our opponent check called the flop and the turn card came the 6 of spades, honestly, I would be very close to shutting down here. Like, not completely. Like, obviously bet anything that's really good. But I mean here, like, I get suspicious, and I think the hands that, like, king jack beat or king queen beat, I don't think we can get 3 streets of value. So I would probably bet king queen for all 3 streets, but king jack I'd probably put in a check. Or I would bet it on the turn with the intention to check on the river, because I just think a lot of what our opponent's going to be check calling with is going to be like a really weak king rag or like pocket 10s or pocket jacks, and I don't think we get 3 streets from them. But it's tough to say. And I also just don't want to run into a tricky opponent that has like pocket kings or ace king or aces or something. But yeah, if we're on the turn, I mean, I'm definitely going to check back like the 9s. And I think even king jack, I'm really going to consider checking back, because I would rather just plan to get the value bet in on the river. And again, this is kind of a weird spot to talk about, because this isn't a spot where we expect our opponent to check call on the flop very often. So it makes it a little bit weird and tricky to play our range. And it also probably makes us want to emphasize exploitative play a little bit more if we do have reads on our opponent or know how our limit in general plays. All right, so let's say he somehow calls that. We got that river. Of course, the river is the 4 bringing the straight. On the river, I would just, again, like it's not so much that I would think we're beat very often if we have king, queen, or king, jack. It's just, I would think it's not a spot where we're going to get called very often by worse hands. So that might make it a really good spot to bluff. But for the most part, if this actually ran out this way, I would just be weirded out by the opponent check calling twice. And then on the 4 river, obviously bet any of our really good stuff. But even something like king, queen, or king, jack, or king, queen specifically, it's really hard to give advice, because on one hand, I could see telling you to bet king, queen being terrible, because it might be like, well, your opponent's just not going to call down with his king rag at this point. You're only value betting against yourself. But by the other hand, it might be like if you're playing against a good opponent who just really doesn't want to see bet this board at 100% of the time, so he does check call twice, then maybe we can bet king queen, because it is a hand that's pretty high up on our range, and our opponent, if he expects us to only bet 7s or better on the river, we don't have that many 7s. So because of that, we might need to value bet some of the king queen too. So definitely a weird spot. Not the hand that I most wanted to go out on, but again, if I randomly generate stuff and we're going to talk about like specific lines, this is just going to happen sometimes. So yeah, so that pretty much wraps up the video. But the things that I really hope you take from this are, firstly, this range, the cutoff 3-bet calling range, it's a much wider range than I played with when I was doing most of my playing like 3 years ago. But it still seems like a pleasure to play. Like, once you really just kind of understand what hands to call with, what mucks on the turn, what mucks on the river, can you raise on this board, or do you always need to defend by calling? Like, once you kind of start to, get that stuff a little bit better, this range seems like it's going to be reasonably easy to play, which is good, because if you're playing a lot of tables, you're not going to play perfectly. It's nice when you have a range that's not too difficult to play. So don't just jump in and start defending this wide recklessly, especially if you think your opponents aren't at 3-bet bluffing enough. But, maybe widen your cutoff 3-bet calling range as you start to get more comfortable and realize you're getting a good price and position when you call pre-flop. It really wasn't hard to defend wide and aggressively with this range at all today. The second thing I would take is, I imagine most people that are watching this that have seen a lot of my videos know a lot of this. I've generated a lot of boards. We're seeing a lot of boards for like the second and third time. So a lot of concepts should become familiar, like how if there's a king and a 10, or if there's just two high cards like a king and a queen, it actually, kind of favors the 3-bet calling range, and then it gives them a lot of draws, and it gives them a lot of pairs. So there's a big difference between, like, as I've mentioned enough this video, there's a big difference between king 10 and king 8. So I think one thing that's really important is, even if you understand something, like, I'm not even just talking in poker, but in life, there's a lot of concepts I understand, but then I get very surprised when I learn more about them, because I realize, even though I understood a concept, I misjudged how big the magnitude is. So, like, especially in poker, I would really try to emphasize, like, you can use, like, Equilab, where even if you, like, understand a concept, yeah, I get how, there's a big difference between a king 10 and a king 8. You might be estimating the magnitude. And I know I did this a couple times this video, where I started off saying, like, it was a concept that I've been very familiar with before. Like, if the board was something like this, where there were 2 flush draws and 3 high cards. And I'm used to there not being a lot of naked flush draws if there's 2 flush draws and it includes 3 high cards. But when I'm talking while I'm thinking, it's very easy for me to misjudge the magnitude of that, and it would cause me to make a mistake while playing if I was, playing a lot of tables and sort of autopiloting. So when you are seeing stuff that's familiar, you get the concept, that's great, and it will make it easier to, like, keep understanding more and more, but try to, like, focus on the magnitude, because, like, the better players are going to be much more precise with this stuff, and there's really no way to know that stuff without analyzing your game away from the tables, which is going to be the best way to learn it. Or if you just play a lot, you'll start to realize, like, oh, you'll pick up as you go how certain people have ranges where they're, like, lacking certain hands that, you could have noticed that just from using Equilab, but you'll also notice that from playing if you are, like, a full-time grinder playing a lot. So yeah, pay attention to the magnitude of the stuff we're talking about, even if a lot of this stuff isn't all that new. All right, guys, I hope you enjoyed the video. Thanks for watching. For the next video in this series, we'll probably be analyzing the players out of position a bit more. All right, good luck, everyone. Bye.